Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Corey, better known as the C-Man, and I want to welcome you to another edition of the C-Man's Cinema Sit Down and back in to a little Spooktober action. That's right, if you've been following along here on the Cinema Sit Down, the old C-Man put together a list of 31 scary, spooky, and Halloween movies. Some of my favorites, some newbies, a mixture of a bunch of different things. And obviously, as you can see, the list doesn't have everything. Heck, some of my favorite horror movies aren't even on here. But that's why we're calling this year's Season 1. Season 2 will be a completely different list. We'll be able to dive into all sorts of great horror movies that we didn't talk about this year. But we have gone through 9, and it is time to dive into our 10th. And in the middle of a little bit of a classic slasher villain run. We've already done Halloween, Michael Myers, Child's Play, Mr. Chucky, and now today, we get to dive into one of my faves. So why don't you pull up a chair, take a seat. We're getting ready to dive into A Nightmare on Elm Street. That's right, baby. Freddy Krueger, one of the scariest of all of the classic slasher villains. Now, granted, I've already said Michael Myers is the all-time scariest, and it's a scary that is like the real type of scary. You know, the thing with Michael Myers it feels real, you know? Like, granted, we talked about how he is more than just a person, but the way he would pop in, the way he would chase you down seems really human. The thing that makes Freddy terrifying is he's the thing that literally nightmares are made of, you know what I mean? Like, when you're a kid and you have a nightmare, that's the type of stuff that can scar you for a whole freaking day if it's bad enough. And the idea of something in your nightmares being able to attack you and kill you, I think that's every kid's worst possible nightmare. And that is exactly what Wes Craven came up with when he came up with A Nightmare on Elm Street. For those unfamiliar, the whole thing with Freddy Krueger is he was, this murdering child murdering psychopath. The town took revenge when he got off and burned him alive inside a boiler room, leaving his spirit to run rampant on children's dreams, and then be able to kill them that way. In your dream, Freddy can kill you, and if he kills you, you die in real life. And the way you die in the dream physically happens. We get one of the craziest and most amazing death sequences in this A Nightmare on Elm Street when our first dreamer that we meet. That's one of the things I love that Wes Craven does with this movie. There's so many things, but one of the things that I love the most is that he gives us a lead in Tina Gray, played by Amanda Weiss, and she isn't really the focus or the actual lead of the movie. She's just the first person that we ride with, and her death involves some of the most innovative stuff we've seen in horror. I mean, Wes and Co. built literally a revolving room that spun 360 degrees. He himself and his DP had like chairs that were built in, that were strapped in, so they could spin with the camera and the room, which is actually funny because when Johnny Depp's death scene happened, it actually broke, like all of the blood that happens in that scene, we'll get there, short-circuited like electric stuff and broke the thing where Wes was actually upside down for like a half hour, but all he cared about was getting the shot. And we'll talk about some of the shots he came up with. But the spinning room, one of the most iconic things that you'd seen as far as a murder sequence in a horror movie. Spinning the room allowed Tina to actually crawl up the wall and act like she was being possessed in a way that really felt real to a degree that we really hadn't seen in horror before. And that was the thing that just makes this movie so iconic in general, is all the things that Wes Craven came up with that we hadn't seen before. Things like Freddy pushing through the wall. I mean, that shot of Freddy over top of Nancy's bed, pushing through the wall, because the wall isn't an actual wall, you use a piece of stretchy white fabric, and it allows Freddy to kind of push through like he's coming out, but almost making the wall like liquidy. It's one of those shots that just sticks with you when you watch the movie. It's like, wow, I'd never seen anything like that before. Or it was doing things that we had seen before, just not in the context of a slasher movie, stuff like the body horror. For the most part, the slasher guys that we had previous, Mrs. Voorhees in Friday the 13th and Michael Myers in Halloween, they were gory to a degree, but there was no body horror elements. These were silent, stalking, just death machines that never stopped coming. And when Wes threw Freddy's name into the mix of the greatest slasher villains of all time, he gave him the classic slasher, weapons, but tweaked them, gave him 4-fingered knives to go slash people with. And then a lot of the horror in the movie is body horror, very much Cronenbergian, if you will, by that point in the world of horror. We'd gotten some crazy body horror type stuff from Cronenberg by that point. We hadn't really seen any of the slashers bring that on. And that brings us to the other thing that makes Freddy great, is the fact that he talks to his victims, that he's wisecracking. Now, his wisecracks, which plays into the body horror, are kind of things like, hey, look at me. Cut off all of my fingers, shoot green blood everywhere, and go ha 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 ha, or cut into his own body so that maggots could crawl out. That type of body horror we hadn't really seen in the classic slasher movies. So adding that element and the fact that Freddy could talk to you while he was hunting you down and make wisecracks, albeit really dark wisecracks, just changed the game in a way that you don't get to Chucky without Freddy Krueger. And Wes Craven's vision for Freddy was just genius. I mean, like I said, playing on the idea of a nightmare. This is a character that can kill you in your sleep. I mean, what's scarier than that? I mean, nightmares are the things that can scar you, if it's scary enough, especially when you're a kid. The idea of something being able to kill you inside your dreams is genius. And then mixing in all different horror elements as well as the innovation to different ways in which he would shoot things or come up with things. Like we said, that death scene for Tina, I mean, the idea of a spinning room, crazy. And then Johnny Depp, you got some of the most blood you'd ever seen in a movie. I think it was 100 gallons worth of blood in the entire movie, and 80 gallons worth of that fake blood was for the Johnny Depp death scene, which, by the way, this is Johnny Depp's debut film. So not only does Wes give you an immediate icon in the world of slasher villains, but also debuts one of the greatest actors of our generation with Johnny Depp. And he gets one of the most iconic death scenes ever. I mean, pulled into his bed and then just gallons of blood come shooting out of it. But as I was mentioning, the spinning room, they used that room for that death scene, and instead of shooting the blood up, they spun everything and shot it down so that it actually pooled on what looked like the ceiling. Just really genius creative things that added so many elements to, A Nightmare on Elm Street that hadn't existed in other slasher flicks. And it really kind of opened the door for all sorts of possibilities in these movies. And on top of, all of the great things that Wes did, both from a writing standpoint with the script and the production elements of the movie, and the way that he shot it, Robert Englund is one of the most iconic, actors of all time in the world of these horror films. And he's one of the few that had been the only one to really ever play the character until they had done that reboot, probably about... Well, I bet by now it's probably almost been a decade since they tried to do that reboot. But, I mean, Englund had done all of them. I mean, even as he got older and Wes said, I'm going to come back and do a new Nightmare. Robert Englund came back, man. That face. That's the other thing. He wasn't a villain who had a mask. His mask was his face. He was burned to death, so he looked like he was wearing a mask, but, it's his face. And, just the expressive nature of Robert Englund's face with that terrifying speaking voice, the way he could drop low or get high and really creep you out. He just had all the things working for him, and the way that he ran and he carried himself, and just the way in which he killed people in the movie. I mean, the different things that they come up with, like the marshmallowy stares, and the sheep becoming like a snake and becoming a noose essentially to hang one of them. Like I said, that Tina scene where she's like, looks like she's possessed on the walls, getting slashed apart, like just really, really bloody, but really, really interesting ways to go about things. And Englund just executes to a degree that's phenomenal. Now, since we already mentioned Mr. Depp, his role, albeit kind of small, is, essential enough. He's one of the core three. As I said, we meet Tina first, who's played by Amanda Weiss. Then we had Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp. And then her boyfriend is Johnny Depp, Glenn Lance. And Depp's solid. He's good for what the role was. The role didn't really require too much, and we hadn't gotten that weird, vision of Johnny that we saw him grow into, where he would kind of do interesting things. This was a pretty straightforward, like, I'm the boyfriend, I'm here to try to help out. Fails multiple times and eventually gives us one of the craziest, bloodiest deaths of all time in cinema history. But the fact that this was his first film, it's just something to be noted, man. It all started in a horror movie. And it's one of those things that I always talk about, man. Horror is one of those things where if you can keep it low budget enough, studios seem to be able to take a risk on it, and a lot of times up-and-coming actors are the ones that you end up using because you're trying to keep to a low budget. Not that this was a super low-budget horror movie, but nevertheless, one of those times where you get a fresh face, and that fresh face blossoms into one of the greatest actors of our generation. So that's all where Johnny Depp started. But our actual lead in the movie, Nancy Thompson, Heather Langenkamp, who would go on to do multiple Nightmare movies. She's fantastic, man. She is the one that Freddy seems dead set on trying to get because she's escaped from him a couple times. And obviously she's been around as he started to kill off all of her friends. And speaking of characters, there is a fourth to the group. Rod Lane, played by Sue Garcia. He is kind of like Tina's on-again, off-again boyfriend to finish out the foursome. But as they kind of get picked off by Freddy, Langenkamp does an excellent job of seeming like someone who hasn't slept for days, losing her mind slightly, and the way she's able to bounce emotionally throughout the whole movie, dealing with the deaths of her friends, but also having to figure out how to beat Freddy. You get what's cool is it's like, it makes me think of Home Alone, and of course Home Alone comes after, but there's a set where she looks into booby traps and things, and she really starts thinking about how she could attack Freddy, and it all kind of starts to culminate when she has a nightmare, gets woken up, and is able to actually bring his hat back. So the other cool thing with these movies is you can latch on to something in the dream, you can bring it back with you, and that kind of becomes Nancy's goal with Freddy, is bring him back and then we'll stop him. And she literally gets dealt a crap hand every step of the way. Like, everything that could possibly go wrong for Nancy Thompson goes wrong in this movie, and Langenkamp just does a really good job of rolling with the punches, and much like Laurie Strode, figures it out, just on basic survival instincts. And, there's just elements to the performance that really set up this, Nancy versus Freddy, and getting down to that showdown and everything that, kind of comes up with it just culminates in something that really, really works. And Langenkamp's performance really helps that along with Robert Englund's. And at the end of the day, this is one of the most iconic of all the horror movies. It's still one of the best rated and reviewed horror movies of all time. It's because Wes Craven came up with a way to reinvent the slasher flick and add things to it, so it didn't look like it was copying its predecessors, but rather building from them and bringing horror to the next evolution of what it could be. And everything that comes from this point forward is really a lot of fun. And the idea of being able to inject fun into the slasher movie is fantastic, because those comedic, notes and breaks amongst the tension really, really work in these types of movies. So all sorts of iconic things, and yet another iconic slasher original with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and another one of my all-time faves. Like I said, you can't go wrong with Robert Englund and Freddy Krueger. I mean, he's just terrifying, and as the movies get more and more ridiculous, as was the case with all of these classic slasher villains, it just allows the character to be more and more ridiculous and really quite funny at times. I love Robert Englund. He's so good. So there you go, man. Those are all my thoughts on A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now the question is, what are you thinking? As we come into the 10th day of October and our 10th film, what are you thinking, man? Where does Freddy Krueger land in your litany of horror villains? For me, in the slasher group, he's probably number 2 right after Michael Myers. But where does he fall for you? Where does A Nightmare on Elm Street fall in your litany of horror movies if you're a horror fan? Have you not seen A Nightmare on Elm Street? If not, let me know. Have we intrigued you at all to maybe want to check it out? I know we're going to spoil a bunch of stuff, but it is one of the classics and definitely well worth a watch. So anything you're thinking, good, bad, indifferent, about A Nightmare on Elm Street and Spooktober, down below in the comments section. Look forward to talking to you down there. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you're new, you want to come hang out and see me all Spooktober long as we count our way down to Halloween, October 31st, and finish up with 31 movies in the month. Or you just want to be here for, trailer reactions and reviews of movies and TV. You want to show a little love, you like the channel? Well, join the C-Maniacs, man. Jump over there, hit that little subscribe button, hit that bell if you want the alerts. And until next time, for the C-Mans, Cinema Sit Down, and another Spooktober edition in the books. I'm the C-Man. I'm signing off. Peace! Well, you guys are still here. You must be looking for some more content. Well, don't worry. C-Man's got you covered, man. You got videos like this guy and this guy. And if you haven't yet, and you want to come check out all the C-Man goodies, join the Cinema Sit Down squad, man. Hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit the little bell down below that, too, so you can get alerts every time I make new videos.